They say blood is thicker than water, but what happens when your own blood drains you dry and leaves you for dead? Tonight, I'm going to tell you the story of a girl who had everything stolen from her, her childhood, her dignity, even her name, and how she fought to claim a life worth living in the dust and heat of 1873 Texas. This is a story about choosing family over blood, about finding home in the most unexpected places. Stay with me until the very end, and comment below what city you're watching from so I can see how far Josie's story travels across this world. The Texas sky hung low and heavy over Red Creek on that October night in 1873, painted in shades of bruised purple and angry red as the sun bled out over the horizon. 19-year-old Josie Marlowe stood in the doorway of what could barely be called a shack, her thin frame silhouetted against the dying light, watching her parents prepare to abandon their children like unwanted baggage. The structure behind her sagged like a drunk leaning against a bar, which was fitting considering that's where her father Royce had spent most of his time and what little money they'd ever had. The walls were more gap than wood, the roof leaked when it rained, and the floor was just packed dirt that turned to mud with every storm. 4 children had grown up in this place, though grown up was a generous term for what had happened to them here. Josie's hands, rough and scarred beyond her years, gripped the splintered doorframe as she watched her father throw the last of their salvageable possessions into the back of a wagon that wasn't even theirs, borrowed from a man in town who'd probably never see it again. Royce Marlowe was a tall man, or had been before whiskey bent his spine and bitterness hollowed out his chest. His face was all hard angles and broken blood vessels, eyes that had long ago stopped seeing his children as anything but mouths to feed and mistakes to regret. Her mother, Hester, moved around the wagon like a ghost, her movements jerky and uncertain. Once, Josie had been told, Hester had been pretty, soft-faced and bright-eyed, the kind of woman who sang while she worked. That woman had died years ago, drowned in the same bottle that had consumed her husband, replaced by this brittle shell who flinched at loud noises and stared at nothing for hours at a time. "Josie, get your worthless hide out here and help with this trunk." Royce's voice cut through the evening air like a whip crack, and Josie felt her shoulders tense automatically, a response trained into her body by years of consequences for moving too slowly. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, as she looked at the man who'd given her life, and then spent 19 years making her wish he hadn't, Josie felt something crack open inside her chest. Not her heart breaking, because that had happened so many times it was more scar tissue than anything else, but something else. Something like the shell of a seed splitting open, or the cocoon of something that had been suffocating for too long finally tearing free. She didn't move. Royce's head snapped toward her, his face darkening. "You deaf girl, I said get out here." "No," Josie said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. Not loud, not defiant, just simple and clear, like stating a fact about the weather. For a moment her father just stared at her, genuinely shocked. In 19 years, Josie had never said no to him. She'd been hit for talking back, starved for showing emotion, locked in the storm cellar for crying when he broke her brother's arm in a drunken rage. She'd learned early that compliance was survival, that making herself small and quiet and useful was the only way to endure. But they were leaving. They were actually leaving, and suddenly all those strategies for survival meant nothing. Royce took a step toward her, his hand already rising, and Josie saw her younger siblings, Wren, just 7 years old, and the twins, Marcus and Samuel, barely 10, peek around the corner of the shack, their eyes wide and frightened. They'd seen this dance before. They knew what came next. Except this time, Hester's thin hand caught Royce's wrist. "Just leave it, Royce. Leave it all." He spun toward his wife, and for a second Josie thought he might hit her instead. But Hester just looked up at him with those dead eyes and said, "What's it matter now? We're going. Let them rot here for all I care." The words should have hurt. Maybe once they would have. But Josie had been hollowed out by harder things than her mother's indifference, and these words just bounced off the armor she'd built around whatever was left of her heart. Royce jerked his arm free and spat in the dirt near Josie's feet. "Fine. You want to stay in this worthless pile of wood with these worthless brats, you do that. See how long you last without me putting food on the table." Josie almost laughed at that. Food on the table. In the last 6 months, she'd been the one catching rabbits with snares made from salvaged wire. the one digging up wild onions and dandelion roots to make soup thin enough to see through. She'd been the one standing between her siblings and starvation while her father drank away what little they had and her mother stared at walls. Instead, she said nothing. She just stood there and watched as Royce climbed up onto the wagon bench, joints popping, movements unsteady. Hester followed, moving like a woman walking to her own execution, her face blank as fresh paper. "You'll come crawling back," Royce called down, gathering the reins with hands that shook. "When you're starving and got nowhere else to go, you'll come begging. And you know what? I won't be there. You hear me, Josie? I won't be there." "Good," Josie said quietly, and for just a second, she saw something flicker across her father's face. Maybe surprise, maybe anger, maybe even something that could have been hurt if he'd still been capable of such human emotion. Then he snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking, horse snorting its displeasure at being worked so late. Hester didn't look back. Neither did Royce. They just rolled away down the dirt track that led toward town and then beyond, toward whatever new disaster they were chasing, leaving behind a cloud of dust that glowed red in the last of the sunset, and 4 children with nothing but a falling-down shack and each other. Josie stood in the doorway until she couldn't see the wagon anymore, until the dust had settled and the sky had gone from red to purple to deep, star-pricked black. Only then did she allow herself to turn around and face what was left. The inside of the shack was worse than the outside, if that was possible. Her parents had taken everything worth taking and some things that weren't. The 3 decent blankets, all the tin cups except one with a broken handle, the cast iron pot that Josie used for everything from cooking to washing. They'd even taken the rough wooden stool that Samuel liked to sit on when his legs hurt, a souvenir from the time Royce had shoved him down the porch steps in a rage. What remained was a pile of rags in one corner that served as bedding, a cracked ceramic bowl, one knife with a blade worn thin from years of sharpening, and a few pieces of wood stacked near a fire pit that was just a circle of stones on the dirt floor. There was no proper stove, no chimney, just a hole in the roof that let the smoke out along with most of the heat. Wren stood in the middle of this devastation, clutching a cornhusk doll that Josie had made for her last Christmas. The little girl's face was streaked with dirt and tears, her blonde hair matted and tangled. She was so thin that her bones seemed to push against her skin, and her feet were bare despite the October chill because her only pair of shoes had fallen apart 2 months ago. "Are they coming back?" Wren asked in a small voice. Marcus and Samuel stood behind their sister, identical in their wide, dark eyes, and the way they held themselves, shoulders hunched, ready to make themselves invisible at a moment's notice. The twins had learned early that being noticed usually meant being hurt, so they'd perfected the art of fading into the background. But now, with their parents gone, they didn't seem to know what to do with themselves. Josie looked at these 3 children, her siblings, her responsibility, her reason for still being alive when there'd been so many moments she'd wanted to give up. And she made a choice. A real choice. Maybe the first one she'd ever made in her life. "No," she said firmly. "They're not coming back. And that's the best thing that could have happened to us." Wren's lower lip trembled. "But what are we going to do?" Josie crossed the small space and knelt in front of her sister, taking the little girl's face in her rough hands. "We're going to survive. We're going to be better than them, and we're going to do it together." Samuel spoke up, his voice cracking slightly. "How? We don't have any food, we don't have any money. Winter's coming, and we don't even have proper walls." It was the most Josie had heard him say in weeks, and the fact that he was speaking at all told her how scared he was. Samuel was the cautious one, the thinker, the boy who calculated risks and usually decided the safest option was silence. "I know," Josie said, standing up and looking around the shack with new eyes. "I know it looks bad, but at least now nobody's going to hit us. Nobody's going to take the food out of our mouths to buy whiskey. Nobody's going to scream at us for crying or lock us in the dark for asking questions." Marcus stepped forward, and Josie noticed he was limping slightly, the legacy of that broken arm that had never been properly set, that had healed crooked because taking him to a doctor would have cost money and Royce had decided whiskey was more important. "So what do we do first?" Practical Marcus. Always wanting a plan, a next step, something concrete to hold on to. Josie loved him for it. "First," she said, "we make a fire. Then we sleep. Tomorrow, we figure out how to live. The fire was harder to make than usual because her father had taken the good kindling, leaving only damp wood and a few scraps of paper. But Josie had learned from necessity how to coax flame from almost nothing, and eventually she got a small fire going in the pit, just enough to push back the darkness and take the edge off the cold that was already seeping through the gaps in the walls. They huddled together under the sagging porch overhang, the four of them wrapped in the pile of rags and pressed close for warmth. The fire crackled and smoked, throwing dancing shadows across their faces. Above them, the Texas sky stretched out infinite and indifferent, stars scattered like salt across black cloth. Josie held Wren against her chest and felt the twins press against her sides, their breathing slowly evening out as exhaustion overcame fear. She stared up at those distant stars and felt something shifting inside her, something fundamental changing in the architecture of who she was. She'd been Josie Marlowe for 19 years, the daughter of drunk Royce Marlowe and broken Hester Marlowe. The girl who got hit, the girl who got blamed, the girl who wasn't pretty enough or good enough or quiet enough or useful enough. That name had been like a rope around her neck, tightening every year, cutting off air and light and any possibility of becoming something other than what her parents had decided she was. But they were gone now. And in the space they'd left behind, there was room for something new. Josie Marlowe died that night under the Texas stars. She didn't die with drama or ceremony. She just let that name settle into her chest like ash from the fire, let it go cold and lifeless and no longer attached to anything that mattered. In its place, there was just Josie. Only Josie. A girl with no last name, belonging to no one, carrying no family legacy of violence and disappointment. She whispered to the dark sky, "I'm nobody's daughter. I'm nobody's anything. Just Josie." The stars didn't answer, but somehow that was perfect. They didn't need to. Josie had spent her whole life being defined by people who saw her as less than human, as a burden and a mistake. The indifference of the universe was almost comforting by comparison. Wren stirred against her chest, mumbling something in her sleep about Mama, and Josie's throat tightened. She pressed a kiss to her sister's tangled hair and made a silent promise. These children would never feel worthless the way she had. They would never wonder if they'd be better off dead. They would never have to become as hard and hollow as Josie had become just to survive. She would make sure of it, even if it killed her. The fire burned down to embers as the night deepened. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, lonely and wild. Closer, an owl hooted from one of the scrub trees that dotted the landscape. The night sounds of Texas, familiar and strangely comforting in their predictability. Josie didn't sleep that first night. She sat watch like a soldier in enemy territory, alert for any sound that might signal danger, her mind racing through possibilities and plans. They had no food except what she might be able to catch or forage. No money, no family to turn to. Royce had burned those bridges years ago, and Hester's people had been dead long before Josie was born. No friends, because the Marlowe family had been outcasts in Red Creek, the cautionary tale that mothers told their daughters about what happened when you married the wrong man. They had nothing. They were nothing. And somehow, impossibly, that felt like freedom. As the first gray light of dawn began to wash across the horizon, Josie finally allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a moment. The children slept on, their faces peaceful in a way they never were when awake, temporarily free from hunger and fear in the mercy of dreams. She was just drifting off when she heard it, the sound of horse hooves on the hard-packed dirt of the road that ran past their property. Josie's eyes snapped open, her body tensing. Nobody came out this way. The Marlowe place was at the end of a dead-end track, surrounded by scrubland and rocky hills good for nothing but rattlesnakes and scorpions. The only people who ever came here were bill collectors, and even they'd stopped bothering months ago when it became clear there was nothing to collect. She carefully disentangled herself from her siblings and stood, her legs stiff from sitting all night, and moved to the edge of the porch. The sun was just breaking over the horizon now, painting everything in shades of gold and amber, and in that early light, she saw him. A man on horseback, moving at an easy pace along the road. Even from a distance, Josie could tell this wasn't someone from town. The horse was too well kept, the man's posture too straight and confident. This was someone who belonged to himself, who moved through the world like he had a right to be in it. As if sensing her gaze, the man turned his head toward the shack. For a long moment, they just looked at each other across the dusty expanse. Josie, barefoot and ragged, standing in front of a building that was barely standing, and the stranger on his fine horse, probably wondering what kind of tragedy he'd stumbled upon. Then he did something that surprised her. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of acknowledgement, a sign of respect that Josie couldn't remember ever receiving from a stranger. He didn't stop, didn't call out, didn't offer pity or judgment. He just acknowledged her existence and rode on. Josie stood there long after he'd disappeared from view, something strange and unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Later, she would recognize it as hope, but in that moment, exhausted and overwhelmed and barely holding herself together, she didn't know what to call it. She only knew that something had shifted. The man on the horse had seen her, really seen her, not looked through her or past her the way most people in Red Creek did when they saw the Marlowe children. He'd tipped his hat to her like she was a person who mattered, like she was someone worthy of basic courtesy. It was such a small thing. It shouldn't have meant anything. But to Josie, standing in the wreckage of her old life and trying to imagine a new one, it meant everything. Behind her, Wren woke with a small sound of distress, and Josie turned away from the empty road to tend to her sister. There would be time later to wonder about mysterious strangers on horseback. Right now there were children to feed and a day to survive, and those were the only things that mattered. The morning revealed the full extent of their situation in harsh, unforgiving detail. The shack had leaked during the last rain, leaving water damage and mold in one corner. The few supplies her parents had left behind were even more meager than Josie had realized in the darkness. A handful of dried beans, a small sack of cornmeal that had already started to spoil, a piece of salt pork so old and hard it was more like leather than meat. Josie did the math in her head and felt her stomach drop. Even if she rationed carefully, they had maybe 3 days of food, 4 if she watered down the cornmeal into mush and supplemented with whatever she could forage. After that, she pushed the thought away. She'd figure something out. She always did. "I'm hungry," Wren said plaintively, rubbing her eyes with small fists. The little girl's stomach was concave, her ribs clearly visible through her thin dress. How long had it been since any of them had eaten a proper meal? Weeks? Months? "I know, sweetheart," Josie said, forcing herself to sound calm and confident. "Let me see what I can make for breakfast." The twins were awake now too, sitting close together the way they always did, watching Josie with those serious, too old eyes. Children shouldn't look like that, she thought. Children should be running and playing and causing trouble, not sitting perfectly still because they'd learned that being noticed meant being hurt. That was going to change. Somehow, some way, Josie was going to give these children a childhood worth having. She didn't know how yet, but she made the promise to herself anyway, fierce and unbreakable. She mixed the cornmeal with water and a pinch of the precious salt, cooking it over the rebuilt fire until it formed a thick porridge. It wasn't much, a few spoonfuls each, but it was warm, and it filled the immediate ache in their bellies. The children ate slowly, making it last, and Josie pretended she'd already eaten so there would be more for them. After breakfast, she sent the twins to check the snare lines she'd set up in the scrubland, hoping maybe they'd gotten lucky and caught a rabbit overnight. She took Wren with her to the small creek about a quarter-mile from the shack, carrying the broken-handled cup to collect water. The creek was running low this time of year, just a trickle between the rocks, but the water was clear and cold. Josie showed Wren how to look for cattails and wild mint, how to dig for Jerusalem artichokes, how to tell the difference between plants that would fill their bellies and plants that would make them sick. The little girl watched with solemn attention, absorbing every word like her life might depend on it. Because it might. That was the reality of their situation, stark and unavoidable. They were 4 children alone in the Texas wilderness with no money, no resources, and winter coming on fast. If Josie couldn't figure out how to keep them fed and warm, they wouldn't survive to see spring. "Josie?" Wren's small voice broke into her thoughts. "What's going to happen to us?" Josie knelt beside the creek, letting the cold water run over her hands, washing away the accumulated dirt and smoke. She looked at her reflection in the dark water, a thin, hard-faced girl with tangled dark hair and eyes that had seen too much. She barely recognized herself. "I don't know," she admitted, because lying to Wren had never felt right, even when the truth was ugly. But we're going to figure it out together, and whatever happens, we're going to do it as a family, a real family, not like... She stopped, searching for words. Not like what Mama and Daddy were. We're going to take care of each other. Wren slipped her small hand into Josie's. I don't want to be a Marlowe anymore. The words hit Josie like a physical blow, not because they hurt, but because they were so perfectly, terribly honest. This 7-year-old child had already learned that some names were curses, that some families were better left behind. You don't have to be, Josie said quietly. We can be anything we want now. We can choose. What did you choose? Wren asked, looking up at her sister with those big, trusting eyes. Josie smiled, and it felt strange on her face, like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use. I'm just Josie. No last name. Just me. Wren thought about this for a long moment, her small face serious. Then she nodded like Josie had said something very wise. Just Wren, she said, testing out the words. I'm just Wren. That's right, Josie said, pulling her sister into a hug. Just Wren, and that's enough. You're enough, exactly as you are. They stayed by the creek for a while longer, gathering what they could. Some cattail roots, a handful of dandelion greens, wild onions that would add flavor to whatever meager meals they could cobble together. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was survival. When they returned to the shack, the twins were waiting with their faces lit up in the first genuine excitement Josie had seen from them in months. We got one, Marcus announced, holding up a scrawny rabbit. The snare actually worked. Samuel was practically bouncing on his toes. And I found a patch of persimmons growing by that old fence line. They're almost ripe. Josie felt something unknot in her chest. One rabbit and some persimmons weren't going to solve their problems, but it was proof that they could do this, that survival was possible. They could feed themselves, at least for today. Tomorrow would have to take care of itself. She showed the children how to skin and clean the rabbit, how to stretch the hide for tanning later, how to use every part of the animal because waste was a luxury they couldn't afford. They roasted it over the fire along with the wild onions and cattail roots, and for the first time in as long as Josie could remember, they had a real meal. It still wasn't enough. They were all too hungry for one rabbit to truly satisfy, but it was so much more than they'd had in weeks that it felt like a feast. They ate slowly, savoring every bite, and when they were done, Wren actually laughed at something Marcus said, a sound so unexpected and beautiful that everyone stopped and stared at her. Then Samuel laughed too, and Marcus, and suddenly they were all laughing together, giddy with food and freedom and the sheer improbability of being alive and together and no longer afraid that a door would slam open and violence would come pouring in. Josie watched her siblings laugh and felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. There would be time for tears later when the children were asleep and she was alone with the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders. Right now, she needed to be strong. She needed to be the foundation they could build on. That night, as they settled down to sleep, Wren curled against Josie's side and whispered, "Tell me a story." "What kind of story?" Josie asked, stroking her sister's tangled hair. "A happy one," Wren said, "about a family that loves each other." Josie's throat tightened, but she managed to speak. Once upon a time, there were 4 children who had nothing but each other, but they discovered that each other was enough. They learned to catch rabbits and find food growing wild, and they learned to laugh again, and they learned that family isn't about blood. It's about who stays when things get hard. "Did they live happily ever after?" Wren asked sleepily. Josie looked down at her sister's face, already relaxing into sleep, and then at the twins on her other side, their breathing deep and steady. "Yes," she said softly. "They did. They absolutely did." She didn't know if it was true. She didn't know if they'd make it through the winter or if they'd still be here when spring came. But in that moment, with her siblings warm and fed and safe, it felt like a truth worth believing in. The next morning brought the first real test of their new life. Josie woke to find frost on the ground outside and could see her breath in the cold air inside the shack. They'd need more wood for the fire, more food, warmer clothes somehow. The list of needs was endless and overwhelming. She was standing outside trying to patch a hole in the roof with some scraps of wood when she heard horse hooves again. She turned, expecting to see maybe someone from town, Perhaps the man they'd borrowed the wagon from, come to demand its return. Instead, it was the man from yesterday morning, the stranger on the fine horse. He rode right up to the broken gate at the edge of their property and stopped, taking in the scene. The falling down shack, the thin children, Josie standing on a rickety ladder with wood scraps in her hands. "Morning," he said, his voice deep and measured. He touched the brim of his hat again, that same gesture of respect that had surprised her before. "Morning," Josie replied warily, climbing down from the ladder. She positioned herself between the man and the shack where her siblings were peeking out nervously. The man didn't dismount. He just sat there on his horse, his face weathered but kind, his eyes taking in everything and judging nothing. He looked to be maybe in his mid-30s, with dark hair showing gray at the temples, and the kind of build that came from years of hard work. "I'm Dane Holloway," he said. "I've got a ranch about 3 miles west of here. Rode past yesterday, and—" He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Wanted to make sure everything was all right." Josie lifted her chin. "We're fine." Dane's eyes flicked to the shack, to the barely there smoke from their small fire, to Josie's too thin frame and bare feet. He didn't call her a liar, but they both knew the truth. "Name?" he asked simply. Josie met his gaze steadily. "Just Josie." Something shifted in Dane's expression, not pity exactly, but understanding, like he knew what it meant when someone gave only a first name, when they'd cut themselves free from whatever came before. He nodded slowly. "Just Josie," he repeated, as if committing it to memory. Then he touched his hat brim one more time and turned his horse back toward the road. Josie watched him go, confused. That was it? He'd ridden all the way out here just to ask if they were all right? But as the day wore on, she began to understand. In the early afternoon, when she went to check the gate, she found a package wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, dried beef, a small sack of flour, a jar of preserves, and a tin of coffee. No note, no name, just supplies that would keep them alive for another week. Josie stood there holding that package, her hands shaking, and felt something crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. Kindness. Unexpected, unasked for, with no strings attached. She didn't know what to do with it. The supplies kept coming. Every few days, Josie would find something at the gate, firewood stacked neatly, blankets worn but clean and warm, a bag of potatoes, a side of bacon wrapped in paper. Never with a note, never with any expectation or demand, just given. And every time, Josie would stand there holding these gifts and feel more and more uncomfortable, like she was building up a debt she could never repay. She'd been raised to believe that nothing was free, that everything came with a price, and the weight of unnamed obligation pressed down on her shoulders. After 2 weeks of this, she'd had enough. She marched the 3 miles to the Holloway Ranch with her siblings in tow, determined to give it all back, to refuse the charity, to maintain the independence she'd claimed for herself. The Holloway Ranch was like something from another world compared to the Marlowe shack. The buildings were solid and well-maintained, the fences straight and strong, the animals healthy and well-fed. There were horses in a corral, chickens scratching in a yard, a vegetable garden that had been put to bed for the winter but showed signs of having been productive during the growing season. It was the kind of place Josie had dreamed about as a child, before she'd learned that dreams were just another way to hurt yourself. Dane Holloway emerged from the barn as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't look surprised to see them, just gave that same nod of acknowledgement he'd offered that first morning. "Mr. Holloway," Josie began, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "I need to talk to you about—" "Dane," he interrupted mildly. "Just Dane." The echo of her own words stopped her short. She regrouped, trying again. "Dane, I appreciate what you've been doing, but I can't accept—" "Then work it off," he said simply, cutting through her prepared speech with those 4 words. Josie blinked. "What?" Dane gestured toward the ranch. "I've got more work than I can handle alone. You want to settle accounts? Come work. Couple hours a day. Your siblings can come too. I could use help feeding chickens, collecting eggs, things like that." It was so simple, so straightforward, that Josie didn't know how to respond. This wasn't charity. This was something else. An exchange. Work for supplies. Fair and clean and honest. "I don't know anything about ranch work," she admitted. Dane shrugged. You'll learn. Tomorrow morning, if you want. If not, he trailed off, not finishing the sentence, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. Josie looked at her siblings, Wren clutching her cornhusk doll, the twins watching with cautious hope. Then she looked back at Dane Holloway, the stranger who'd shown them more kindness in 2 weeks than their own parents had in their entire lives. Tomorrow morning, she said. We'll be here. Dane nodded once, satisfied. Good. Sunrise. Bring appetites. I make a big breakfast. And just like that, their new life truly began. True to her word, Josie arrived at the Holloway Ranch just as the first pink light touched the eastern horizon. She'd left the children sleeping under the careful watch of Marcus, who at 10 years old had learned to be responsible beyond his years. The walk had been cold in the pre-dawn darkness, and Josie's thin shawl did little to keep out the October chill, but she'd made a promise, and she intended to keep it. Dane was already up, smoke rising from the chimney of the main house, light glowing warm in the windows. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hit Josie like a physical force, making her stomach clench with hunger so fierce it was almost painful. When had she last smelled bacon cooking? Years, maybe. Her father had always sold anything valuable for drink money, and breakfast at the Marlowe house had been whatever scraps could be cobbled together, if there was anything at all. The door opened before she could knock, and Dane stood there in his shirt sleeves, looking unsurprised to see her. Right on time. Come in. Josie hesitated on the threshold. She'd been inside maybe 3 houses in her entire life that weren't her own miserable shack, and the idea of entering this stranger's home felt dangerous somehow, like crossing a line she couldn't uncross. It's just breakfast, Josie, Dane said quietly, reading her hesitation with unnerving accuracy. No strings, no expectations, just food before work. Still she wavered, and he added, Your siblings are welcome too. I meant what I said about feeding them. They're sleeping, Josie said, her voice coming out rougher than intended. Marcus is watching them. Dane nodded and stepped back, giving her space to make her own choice. That small gesture, the way he never pushed, never demanded, just offered and waited, made something in Josie's chest ache. She stepped inside. The interior of the house was simple but well kept. Wooden floors that had been swept clean, furniture that was sturdy if not fancy, curtains at the windows that had been mended but were whole. On the walls hung a few photographs in simple frames and a rifle mounted above the fireplace. Everything spoke of a man who lived alone but took care of his space, who valued order and cleanliness even when no one was watching. Sit, Dane said, gesturing to a table that already had 2 places set. Coffee? I don't drink coffee, Josie said automatically. Then felt stupid because of course she didn't drink coffee. Coffee cost money, and the Marlowes had never had money for such luxuries. Well, now's a good time to start, Dane replied mildly, pouring a cup and setting it in front of her. You'll need it if you're going to keep up with ranch work. The coffee was hot and bitter, and unlike anything Josie had ever tasted. She forced herself to drink it, feeling the warmth spread through her chest, while Dane served up plates of food that made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. Eggs, bacon, biscuits with butter, fried potatoes seasoned with salt and pepper. More food on one plate than she usually saw in a week. Eat, Dane said, sitting down across from her with his own plate. You're too thin to be doing hard work on an empty stomach. Josie wanted to eat slowly, to savor every bite, but her body had other ideas. She found herself shoveling food into her mouth like a starving animal, barely chewing, her hands shaking with the effort of not grabbing everything at once. It was humiliating, this loss of control, this physical proof of how desperate her situation really was. Dane said nothing. He just ate his own breakfast at a normal pace and kept his eyes on his plate, giving her the dignity of not being watched while she revealed her hunger. When she finally slowed down, her stomach painfully full for the first time in memory, Dane pushed a cloth-wrapped bundle across the table toward her. For your siblings. There's enough for all 3 of them and some left over for tomorrow. Josie stared at the bundle, then at Dane. Why are you doing this? Doing what? Being kind, helping us. You don't know us. We're nobody to you. Dane was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, like he was picking his way across uncertain ground. I knew someone once, a long time ago. She had children and no way to feed them, and people in town looked the other way because getting involved was too complicated, too messy. By the time anyone did anything, it was too late. He met Josie's eyes, and she saw something dark and painful in his gaze, old grief that had settled deep into his bones. I swore then that if I ever saw someone in need, someone trying to survive against impossible odds, I wouldn't look away. So I'm not. That's all. Josie wanted to ask more. Who was the woman? What had happened to her children? Why did Dane live alone in this well-kept house with photographs on the walls, but no family in the rooms? But something in his expression told her these were stories for another time, if ever. Instead, she said, "What do you need me to do?" Dane's face shifted, the grief sliding back behind practiced walls, replaced by something more businesslike. "Can you muck out a stable?" "I can learn." "Good enough. Come on, I'll show you." The work was harder than anything Josie had done before, which was saying something considering she'd spent her life scraping survival from nothing. Mucking out stables meant hauling wheelbarrows full of soiled hay and horse manure to a compost pile, spreading fresh straw, making sure water troughs were clean and filled. Her back ached within the first hour, her hands blistered despite the work gloves Dane had given her, and sweat soaked through her thin dress, even in the cool morning air. But there was something satisfying about it, too. The work had clear goals and visible results. When she finished, she could look at the clean stable and know she'd accomplished something real. It was so different from the Sisyphean task of trying to keep her siblings alive in the shack, where every small victory was immediately swallowed by the next crisis. Dane worked alongside her for the first hour, showing her what to do, then left her to it while he tended to other ranch business. Josie appreciated that, too. The way he trusted her to figure things out, didn't hover or micromanage or treat her like she was helpless. By midday, she was exhausted but satisfied. The stable was clean, the horses fed and watered, and Dane had shown her how to check their hooves for stones and brush their coats until they gleamed. 3 of them, a bay mare, a gray gelding, and a young chestnut, had leaned into her touch with soft snorts of pleasure, and Josie had felt something unfamiliar bloom in her chest. When was the last time anything had responded to her touch with pleasure instead of fear? "You've got a hand with horses," Dane observed, appearing at her elbow with 2 tin cups of water. He offered her one, which she accepted gratefully, her throat dry as dust. "They're easier than people," Josie said without thinking, then flushed, embarrassed by her own honesty. Dane just smiled slightly. "Can't argue with that. Horses don't lie. Don't make promises they can't keep. You know where you stand with them." They stood there in companionable silence, drinking their water, watching the horses move around the corral. It was peaceful in a way Josie had never experienced. This simple sharing of space with another person without tension or fear, without waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Tomorrow, bring your siblings," Dane said finally. "The twins can help with the chickens and the garden cleanup. Wren's probably too young for heavy work, but she can collect eggs. It's good for children to learn useful skills." "I can't pay you for feeding them," Josie said, the words sticking in her throat but needing to be said. "Didn't ask you to. They work, they eat. Same as you. Fair exchange." There it was again, that straightforward honesty that Josie didn't know how to handle. In her experience, nothing was ever fair, and exchanges always favored whoever had the power. But Dane seemed to operate by different rules, ones she was still learning to understand. Over the next 2 weeks, a routine developed. Josie and her siblings would arrive at sunrise, work until noon, eat lunch that Dane provided, then work another few hours before heading home with bundles of food and sometimes other necessities. A shirt that didn't fit Dane anymore, but would work for Marcus. A pair of boots that had belonged to someone smaller, their soles worn but still functional. The children thrived under the structure and the steady meals. Wren lost that hollow-eyed look and started chattering again, her natural cheerfulness resurging now that she wasn't constantly hungry and afraid. The twins filled out slightly, their movements becoming less furtive, more confident. They still startled at loud noises and moved carefully around adults. But Dane's patient kindness was slowly teaching them that not all grown men were dangerous. Josie learned quickly, driven by a fierce determination to prove she could pull her weight. She learned to mend fences, to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg, to can vegetables and cure meat for the winter. Dane taught her about animal husbandry and crop rotation, about reading weather signs and managing resources. He taught her the way he did everything, patiently, without condescension, treating her like someone capable of learning rather than someone inherently stupid. One afternoon in early November, Josie was in the barn repairing a bridle when she heard voices outside. She recognized Dane's rumbling baritone, but not the higher, sharper voice that cut across it. Curious, she moved to the barn door and peered out. A woman stood in the yard, well-dressed in town clothes with a feathered hat and a pinched expression. She was gesturing animatedly while Dane stood with his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. "It's unseemly, Dane," the woman was saying. "Having that Marlowe girl around here, and those children. People talk." "Let them talk," Dane replied evenly. "You don't understand what you're getting into. That family is nothing but trouble. The father's a drunk, the mother's no better, and those children are probably just as bad. Bad blood runs deep." Josie felt her face burn with shame and anger. She knew this woman, Mrs. Henderson, one of the town gossips who'd always looked at the Marlowe children like they were diseased. But hearing her own fears spoken aloud, the worry that she carried her parents' poison in her veins made something sharp and painful twist in her chest. "Those children," Dane said, his voice taking on an edge Josie had never heard before, "work harder than most grown men I know. They're polite, responsible, and they've survived things that would break most people. I don't care whose blood they carry. I care about who they are." Mrs. Henderson sniffed. "Well, I suppose you'll learn the hard way. Just don't say I didn't warn you when they rob you blind or burn the place down." "Margaret," Dane said, and now his voice was cold as winter wind, "you need to leave my property, and unless you have something kind to say about children who've done nothing but try to survive, don't come back." The woman's face went red, then white. She sputtered for a moment, then turned on her heel and marched toward her buggy, her skirts swishing with indignation. Josie ducked back into the barn, her heart pounding. She heard the buggy pull away, then Dane's boots on the barn floor. "You can come out," he said quietly. "I know you heard." Josie emerged from behind the stall, her chin up but her hands shaking. "Is that what people in town say? That we're bad blood?" Dane looked at her steadily. "Some people. The ones whose opinions don't matter to me." "But what if she's right?" The words burst out before Josie could stop them. "What if I'm just like them? What if I'm mean and worthless and—" "Stop!" Dane's voice was sharp enough to cut through her spiral. "Just stop. You are not your parents, Josie. You are not defined by the blood in your veins or the name you were born with. You are defined by your choices, and every choice you've made has been about protecting and providing for those children. That's not bad blood. That's strength." Josie felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "You don't know what I came from, what I grew up in, the things I saw, the things that were done to us. You're right. I don't know all of it. But I know this. You survived it. You didn't let it make you cruel or bitter or give up. You could have walked away from those kids, left them to fend for themselves, saved only yourself. But you didn't. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are." The tears came then, hot and unexpected, streaming down Josie's face before she could stop them. She turned away, humiliated by this loss of control. But Dane just stood there and let her cry, not touching her or offering empty comfort, just being present. When she finally got herself under control, wiping her face with her sleeve, Dane said quietly, "The woman who died, the one I told you about. Her name was Sarah. She was my sister." Josie's head snapped up, shock temporarily overwhelming her embarrassment. Dane was staring at something far away, his jaw tight. "She married young, to a man our parents approved of. Rich, respectable, good family. Turned out he was also cruel and controlling and slowly isolated her from everyone who cared about her. By the time I realized how bad it was, she had 3 children and no way out. I tried to help, but she was terrified of what he'd do if she left. Then one winter, he gambled away all their money and disappeared. Sarah was left with nothing. No food, no fuel, 3 small children." His hands clenched into fists. "I was working a ranch 200 miles away. By the time I got word and came home, she was dead. Pneumonia, they said, but really it was starvation and cold and hopelessness. The children barely survived. They live with my aunt now, and they're fine, but Sarah—" He stopped, his voice rough with old pain. She didn't have to die. If someone had helped earlier, if people hadn't been so concerned with propriety and appearances, if I hadn't been so far away. That's not your fault, Josie said softly. Maybe not. But I swore on her grave that I'd never stand by and watch someone suffer when I had the means to help. So when I saw you and those children in that falling down shack trying to survive on nothing, I saw Sarah. I saw a second chance to do what I couldn't do for her. Josie understood then, in a way that went deeper than words. Dane wasn't helping them out of pity or because he thought they were helpless. He was helping them because not helping would haunt him, because somewhere in his heart, every meal he gave them was a meal he couldn't give his sister, every kindness a kindness he'd arrived too late to offer. I'm not going to disappoint you, Josie said fiercely. I'm not going to waste this chance. I promise. Dane finally looked at her, and his expression was soft in a way she'd never seen. You couldn't disappoint me if you tried. You're already one of the strongest people I know. The moment hung between them, weighted with things neither of them knew how to say. Then Dane cleared his throat and gestured toward the bridle in her hands. How's that repair coming? Josie looked down at the leather she'd been working on, grateful for the return to practical matters. Almost done. The stitching's holding well. Good. When you're finished, there's a saddle in the tack room that needs conditioning. I'll show you how. They fell back into the easy rhythm of work and instruction, but something had shifted between them. There was a deeper understanding now, a shared acknowledgement of the wounds they both carried and the ways they were trying to heal them. That evening, as Josie and her siblings walked home with their bundles of food and a warm coat Dane had insisted Wren take, Marcus spoke up. Mr. Holloway's different from other grown-ups. How so? Josie asked, though she knew what he meant. He doesn't yell. He doesn't hit. When Samuel dropped that bucket of feed yesterday, he just showed him how to carry it better. He didn't even get mad. Samuel nodded vigorously. And he listens when we talk, like we're real people, not just kids. We are real people, Wren said indignantly. We've always been real people. I know, Samuel said patiently, but most adults don't act like they know that. Josie felt a lump in her throat. Her siblings were learning what kindness looked like, learning that adults could be safe and steady and trustworthy. It was a gift beyond price, this knowledge that there was another way to live. November deepened into early winter, and their life found a rhythm. Work at the ranch during the day, evenings in the shack that was slowly becoming more livable as Dane helped them patch the worst gaps, and Josie learned to manage their resources better. The children were learning to read and write under Josie's patient instruction, using an old primer Dane had found somewhere and a slate board he'd brought them. They were still poor, still struggling, but they were surviving. More than surviving, they were building something. Then came the fever. It started with Josie feeling tired, which wasn't unusual given the long days of hard work. Then came the chills, the aching joints, the dizzy spells that made the world tilt and swim. She pushed through it for 2 days, determined not to miss work, not to lose this precious opportunity Dane had given them. On the 3rd day, she collapsed in the barn while hauling water. She woke in Dane's house, in a real bed with clean sheets and a soft pillow, her body burning like she'd been set on fire from the inside. Dane sat in a chair beside the bed, and when he saw her eyes open, relief flooded his face. Easy, he said when she tried to sit up. You've been out for hours. Doc Williams says it's pneumonia. Panic seized her. My siblings are fine. They're here, in the other room. I'm keeping an eye on them. Right now you need to focus on getting well. I can't stay here, Josie protested, though even speaking made her chest ache. It's not proper. People will talk. Let them talk, Dane said firmly. You're sick and you need care. That's all that matters. For 3 days, Josie drifted in and out of fevered dreams. She was vaguely aware of Dane's presence, of cool cloths on her forehead, of being coaxed to drink bitter medicine and thin broth. Once she woke crying from a nightmare about her father, and Dane's voice cut through the terror, steady and real. You're safe. He's gone. You're safe here. On the 4th day, the fever broke. Josie woke clear-headed for the first time in what felt like forever, weak as a kitten, but finally able to think straight. Dane was asleep in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted back at an angle that would give him a terrible crick in his neck, dark circles under his eyes. He'd stayed with her. Through her sickness, her vulnerability, her complete helplessness, he'd stayed. Josie lay there watching him sleep and felt something shift in her chest, something warm and terrifying and entirely new. She'd been so focused on survival, on keeping her siblings safe, that she hadn't allowed herself to feel anything beyond the immediate necessities of staying alive. But now, looking at this man who'd shown her nothing but kindness, who'd asked for nothing in return, who'd literally kept vigil by her bedside, she was falling in ways that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the realization that for the first time in her life, someone had chosen to stay. Dane's eyes opened, and he straightened immediately when he saw she was awake. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Josie said, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Weak, but better." Relief washed over his features. "Good. You had us worried. Doc Williams said it was touch and go there for a while." "My siblings?" "Safe. Healthy. They've been helping around the ranch while you recovered. Wren's been beside herself with worry, but she's been brave." Josie tried to sit up and found she barely had the strength. Dane immediately moved to help her, propping pillows behind her back with gentle efficiency. His hands were careful, respectful, never lingering. "I have something for you," he said, moving to the small table by the bed. He picked up a folded piece of paper and handed it to her. Josie unfolded it with shaking hands. The paper was rough, the handwriting painstaking and uneven, clearly written by someone still learning their letters. But the message was clear. "Dear Josie, please get well. We need you. We love you. Your family." At the bottom, 3 names: Wren, Marcus, Samuel. Not Marlowe. Just first names. Just family. Josie's vision blurred with tears. They wrote this themselves? Every word. They'd been practicing their letters while you were sick. Wanted to make sure you knew. He trailed off, then added quietly, "They're not the only ones who need you to get well." Josie looked up at him, at this man who'd given them so much and asked for nothing, and found herself saying, "Why? Why do all this for us?" Dane was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful. At first it was about Sarah, about making up for failing her, but now he met her eyes, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Now it's because you matter. All of you matter. Not because of what you can do or what you might become, but because of who you are right now. You're worth taking care of, Josie. You need to know that." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. Worth taking care of. Not useful, not necessary, not even deserving, just worth it. Worth the effort, worth the resources, worth someone's time and care, simply by virtue of existing. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything." Dane stood, moving toward the door. "Rest now. Get your strength back. Everything else can wait." But as he reached the door, Josie found her voice. "Dane?" He turned back. "Thank you. For everything, for..." She gestured helplessly, unable to encompass everything he'd done in words. "For staying." His smile was soft and sad and understanding all at once. "You are not alone," he said simply, and closed the door behind him. Josie lay back against the pillows, clutching the note from her siblings, and let herself cry. Not from fear or pain or desperation, but from something that felt dangerously close to hope. If you or someone you know is having a difficult time, free support is available. Find resources. Recovery came slowly, measured in small victories that Josie had never thought to celebrate before. The first time she made it from the bed to the chair without Dane's help. The first solid meal she could keep down. The first morning she woke without her chest feeling like it was caught in a vice. Each day brought a little more strength, a little more clarity, and with it, a growing awareness of just how much had changed in the months since her parents had driven away. Wren was the first to visit once Dane deemed Josie strong enough for company. The little girl burst into the room like a small, determined storm and threw herself onto the bed, wrapping her thin arms around Josie's neck with a fierceness that spoke of genuine terror barely held at bay. "Don't ever get sick again," Wren whispered into Josie's shoulder, her voice muffled and thick with tears. "I thought you were going to leave us like Mama and Daddy did." Josie stroked her sister's tangled hair, her own throat tight. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. It takes more than a fever to get rid of me." Promise? I promise. The twins came in next, more reserved, but with the same undercurrent of fear in their eyes. They'd learned young that the adults in their lives were unreliable, that permanence was a myth and safety could evaporate in an instant. Josie's illness had shaken that fragile trust they'd been building. We helped Mr. Holloway with everything, Marcus said, his voice earnest. Fed all the animals, collected eggs, even helped fix the fence in the north pasture. So you don't have to worry that we weren't earning our keep while you were sick. The words broke Josie's heart a little. 10 years old and already so worried about earning their right to exist, about proving their worth through labor. It was a lesson beaten into them by parents who'd viewed children as burdens, and it would take more than a few months of kindness to undo that damage. I'm so proud of you both, Josie said firmly, but you don't have to earn anything. You're children. You're allowed to just be children. Samuel looked skeptical. Mr. Holloway says the same thing, but we like helping. It feels good to do something useful. Dane appeared in the doorway then, and the children immediately straightened, their faces brightening in a way that still surprised Josie. They'd gone from flinching at the sound of a man's footsteps to lighting up when Dane entered a room, and the transformation was both beautiful and heartbreaking. All right, you three, Dane said with gentle authority. Josie needs her rest. You can visit again tomorrow. Wren kissed Josie's cheek before climbing down from the bed, and the twins each squeezed her hand. As they filed out, Josie heard Wren asking Dane if she could help make dinner, her voice bright with enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Dane lingered in the doorway after the children left, and Josie caught something in his expression, a softness, a warmth, as he watched them head toward the kitchen. They're good kids, he said, more to himself than to her. They are. Thanks to you. He shook his head. They were always good kids. They just needed someone to see it. Over the next week, as Josie regained her strength, she spent more time out of bed, first sitting in the main room of Dane's house, then helping with small tasks that didn't require much physical exertion. She peeled potatoes for dinner, mended clothes, helped Wren practice her letters. The domesticity of it all felt strange and dangerous, like trying on a life that didn't belong to her. One evening, as they all sat around Dane's table for dinner, a real family meal with everyone together, passing dishes and talking about their day, Josie caught herself laughing at something Samuel said, and the sound shocked her. When had she last laughed like that, unguarded and genuine? When had she last felt safe enough to let her guard down? Dane met her eyes across the table, and his smile said he understood exactly what that moment meant. The children chattered on, oblivious, but between Josie and Dane passed a current of understanding that needed no words. After dinner, when the children were settled by the fire with their slate boards, Dane gestured for Josie to follow him outside. The December air was cold and clean, stars scattered across the black sky like diamonds on velvet. Their breath made clouds in the frigid air as they stood on the porch, looking out over the ranch that had somehow become more home than the shack Josie still technically lived in. I've been thinking, Dane said carefully, about your situation. Josie tensed automatically, bracing for whatever came next. In her experience, when someone started a conversation that way, it usually meant something was about to be taken away. Dane must have sensed her tension because he added quickly, "Nothing bad, just thinking about winter. It's going to get colder, and that shack isn't going to keep you warm. The children could get sick, or you could have a relapse, and—" He paused, choosing his words. I have space here, a spare room. It's not much, but it's warm and dry and safe. You could stay here, all of you. Josie's heart stuttered. We can't do that. Why not? Because people already talk. Mrs. Henderson made that clear. If we actually move in here, unmarried girl and a man alone, they'll say, let them say whatever they want, Dane interrupted, his voice harder than usual. I don't care about gossip, Josie. I care about keeping 4 children alive through a Texas winter in a house that's barely standing. But your reputation, my reputation can handle it. Can your siblings handle another winter in that shack? He turned to face her fully, and in the moonlight, his expression was fierce. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm not expecting anything from you. I'm just offering shelter, a warm place to sleep, regular meals, safety, that's all. Josie wanted to say yes so badly, it physically hurt. The thought of warm beds for the children, of not having to choose between buying food and buying firewood, of not lying awake every night terrified that she'd wake up to find one of them frozen or sick or worse. It was almost unbearably tempting. But she'd learned young that nothing was free. Every gift came with strings attached, every kindness had a price, and sooner or later the bill came due. "What do you want in return?" she asked, hating how her voice shook but needing to know. Dane's face softened. "Nothing. I want nothing in return except the peace of mind of knowing you're all safe. That's all I've ever wanted, Josie." "Nobody's that good," she whispered. "Nobody just gives without expecting something back." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion. "My sister died because she was too proud to ask for help and too scared to accept it when it was offered. I've spent 5 years wondering if things would have been different if I'd been more insistent, if I'd found a way to make her understand that accepting help isn't weakness, it's survival." He stepped closer, and Josie could see the pain in his eyes, raw and real. "Don't make her mistake. Don't let pride kill you or those children when there's another option." The words hit like a physical blow. Josie had spent so long viewing self-sufficiency as the only form of dignity available to her that the thought of accepting help felt like surrender. But what Dane was offering wasn't charity born of pity. It was born of grief, of hard-learned lessons, of a desperate need to save someone because he couldn't save the person who mattered most. "If we stay," Josie said slowly, "we work. We earn our keep. We're not freeloaders. I wouldn't expect anything less. And if people talk, if it damages your standing in town, then they weren't worth having in my life anyway." Josie looked back through the window at her siblings, warm and fed and safe in Dane's house. Wren was showing Samuel something on her slate, her small face animated. Marcus was whittling a piece of wood with a knife Dane had given him, teaching him how to use tools properly instead of just forbidding him to touch them. They were happy here. For the first time in their lives, they were genuinely happy. "Okay," Josie said, and the word felt like jumping off a cliff with no idea if there was water or rocks below. "We'll stay, but I want it in writing, what we owe, what we're expected to do, everything, no misunderstandings." Dane nodded seriously. "Fair enough. We'll write it all out tomorrow, a proper agreement." They went inside after that, and Dane pulled out paper and pen. Together, they drafted a simple contract, room and board in exchange for labor on the ranch, with specific duties listed out for Josie and age-appropriate tasks for the children. It was businesslike and clear, and having it in writing made Josie feel like she had some control over a situation that terrified her with its potential for disaster. Moving their meager possessions from the shack to Dane's house took less than an hour. They owned so little that everything fit into 3 flour sacks. The spare room Dane offered them was larger than the entire shack had been, with a real bed and a smaller cot, a chest of drawers, and a window that actually had glass in it. To Josie and her siblings, it felt like a palace. That first night in the new room, with all 4 of them clean and warm and safe, Wren whispered into the darkness, "Is this real? Or are we going to wake up back in the old place?" "It's real," Josie assured her, though she had the same fear. "We're really here." "I like it here," Samuel said softly. "Mr. Holloway is nice. He doesn't yell or hit or call us stupid. He teaches us stuff," Marcus added. "Real stuff that we can use. And he listens when we talk." Josie listened to her siblings process this new reality and felt a wave of fierce protectiveness wash over her. They were learning what kindness looked like, what safety felt like. She would do whatever it took to make sure they never had to unlearn those lessons. The winter that followed was unlike anything Josie had experienced. For the first time in her life, cold weather didn't mean suffering. It meant warm fires and hot meals, sturdy walls and thick blankets. It meant waking up without frost on the inside of the windows, without the ache of hunger gnawing at her stomach. But it also meant proximity to Dane in ways that both comforted and terrified her. They fell into a rhythm, a domesticity that felt dangerously close to being a real family. Dane taught the boys how to work wood and leather, how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to judge distances and calculate angles for fence building. He taught Wren how to collect eggs without frightening the chickens, and how to churn butter, and how to be gentle with frightened animals. And he taught Josie things she'd never imagined learning, how to keep books and manage accounts, how to judge the quality of livestock, how to plan for seasons ahead instead of just surviving day to day. He treated her like an equal partner in running the ranch, asking her opinion on decisions, trusting her judgment. It was intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. The people of Red Creek noticed the change, of course. Gossip spread through the small town like wildfire. Speculation about what was really going on at the Holloway Ranch with those Marlowe children living there. Some of it was cruel, some of it was concerned, all of it was invasive. Dane handled it with the same steady calm he brought to everything else. When people asked him directly about his living arrangements, he told them the truth. He was providing shelter for children who needed it, and anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with God. Most people backed down in the face of his quiet certainty, but not everyone. It was a cold January afternoon when trouble arrived in the form of a wagon pulling up to the ranch, carrying a man in a fine black coat and a permanent scowl. Josie was in the barn with Dane, learning how to treat a horse's infected hoof when they heard the commotion outside. The man who climbed down from the wagon was tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled in its life. He surveyed the ranch with the air of someone evaluating property, and when his eyes landed on the children playing in the yard, his expression turned calculating. "That's Vernon Marlowe," Josie whispered, her blood turning to ice. "My father's cousin. I haven't seen him since I was small, but I remember him coming around once, trying to get Daddy to sign over some land he'd inherited." Dane's expression hardened. "Stay behind me." They walked out to meet Vernon, and Josie instinctively positioned herself between the man and her siblings. The children had gone quiet, sensing danger the way animals sense a coming storm. "Well, well," Vernon said, his voice oily and smooth. "Little Josie Marlowe, all grown up, and these must be the other brats." His eyes raked over the children with cold assessment. "Word reached me that Royce and Hester finally did the sensible thing and abandoned you lot. Took them long enough." "What do you want?" Josie asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Vernon smiled, showing yellowed teeth. "Just checking on family. These children are Marlowe's after all. My bloodkin. Can't have them living like beggars when they've got family who could take them in." It was a lie, and everyone knew it. Vernon Marlowe had never shown the slightest interest in his relatives before, had in fact refused to help when Royce had come begging for money during one of his particularly desperate periods. "They're fine where they are," Dane said flatly. Vernon's eyes slid to Dane, dismissive and contemptuous. "And who are you, the charity case keeper? I heard about you, Holloway. Heard you've been playing house with my cousin's children. Mighty generous of you, taking in strays." "These children aren't strays, and they're not going anywhere with you," Dane replied, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "That's not your decision to make," Vernon said, pulling a paper from his coat pocket. "I've got legal documentation here showing I'm next of kin. These children belong with family, not with some stranger who's got no claim to them at all." Josie felt panic rising in her throat. She'd heard of this before, distant relatives showing up to claim children, not out of love, but because children meant extra hands for work, extra bodies to generate income. In Texas, in 1873, children had few rights, and blood relation meant everything in the eyes of the law. "We're not going with you," Marcus said suddenly, stepping forward with his brother at his side. "We're staying here." Vernon laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You don't get a choice, boy. You're 10 years old. You'll go where you're told." "Like hell they will," Dane said, and there was something in his voice that made Vernon take a step back despite himself. A crowd was gathering now. Several of Dane's neighbors had noticed the commotion and come to investigate, and townspeople who'd been passing by on the road had stopped to watch. Mrs. Henderson was there, her face alight with the prospect of juicy gossip. The blacksmith, Tom Reed, stood with his arms crossed. The schoolteacher, Miss Sarah Winters, watched with concern in her eyes. Vernon seemed to gain confidence from the audience. "These people can witness that I'm doing the right thing, the legal thing. Family takes care of family. These children are Marlowe's, and they belong with Marlowe blood." "Family," Dane said, his voice carrying clearly across the yard, "is who stays when it storms, not who shows up when it's convenient. Where were you when these children were starving? Where were you when they were sleeping in a falling down shack with no food and no help? You didn't care about Marlowe blood then. I didn't know the situation. Everyone in Red Creek knew the situation, Dane cut him off. Everyone knew Royce Marlowe was drinking away every cent he had, and those children were suffering, but nobody wanted to get involved because it was easier to look away. Now they're fed and clothed and safe, and suddenly you show up claiming family ties? He shook his head. That's not family. That's opportunism. Vernon's face darkened. You've got no legal standing here, Holloway. The law says bloodkin have first claim. These children are coming with me, and there's nothing you can do about it. The law also says children have the right to be protected from harm, Miss Winters spoke up suddenly. Everyone turned to look at the school teacher, a slight woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind. And from what I've observed, these children have thrived under Mr. Holloway's care. They're healthier, better educated, and clearly happier than they ever were under their parents' roof. Any judge would take that into consideration. She's right, Tom Reed added gruffly. I remember seeing those kids when their parents were still around. Skinny as rails, covered in bruises, scared of their own shadows. Look at them now. That's not the work of someone looking to exploit them. Other voices joined in, people stepping forward to add their observations. Even Mrs. Henderson surprisingly spoke up. I may have had concerns about propriety, but I can't deny the children are better off. Whatever Mr. Holloway's arrangement is, it's working. Vernon looked around at the gathering crowd, his confidence wavering. He'd expected to swoop in, claim the children, and leave without opposition. Instead, he was facing a wall of community support for Dane's guardianship. Then Wren, small and fierce and braver than anyone had given her credit for, pushed forward until she stood directly in front of Vernon. She tilted her head back to look up at him, and her voice rang out clear and strong. We're not Marlowes anymore. We're Holloways now. The words fell into the gathered crowd like a stone into still water, ripples spreading outward. Josie felt them hit her chest with physical force. The twins moved to flank their sister, Marcus on one side, Samuel on the other, presenting a united front. Mr. Holloway gave us a home when nobody else would, Samuel said quietly. He taught us that we matter, that we're worth taking care of. That's what real family does. Vernon sputtered, his face red with anger and embarrassment. You can't just change your name because you feel like it. You're Marlowes, born and bred, and that's what you'll die as. Josie found herself moving forward, not even conscious of the decision until she was standing beside her siblings, facing down the man who represented everything she'd tried to escape. And beside her, like it was the most natural thing in the world, Dane took his place, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. You're wrong, Josie said, her voice steady and strong. She reached out and took Dane's hand, threading her fingers through his, feeling the calluses from years of honest work, the warmth of someone who'd chosen to care. The gesture sent a murmur through the crowd, but Josie didn't care. We're not defined by the blood we were born with. We're defined by who we choose, and I choose the man who carried our future instead of cursing our past. She turned to look at Dane, and in his eyes she saw everything she needed to know. Surprise, yes, and something deeper. Warmth, pride, and something else that made her breath catch. My name, Josie said, turning back to face Vernon and the gathered townspeople, is Josie Holloway. The crowd erupted. Some people cheered, others gasped. Mrs. Henderson looked scandalized and delighted in equal measure. Vernon stood frozen, his legal papers hanging limply in his hand, defeated not by law but by something stronger, by choice, by community, by the undeniable truth that these children had found a real home. You can't just, Vernon started, but Dane cut him off. She just did. They all did. And you need to leave my property now, before I have Tom here help you understand what happens to people who threaten my family. Tom Reed cracked his knuckles meaningfully, and several other men in the crowd moved forward in silent support. Vernon looked around at the hostile faces, realized he was outnumbered and outmatched, and backed toward his wagon. This isn't over, he spat. I'll take this to the courts. You'll waste your time and money on a fight you can't win, Miss Winters said crisply. I'll personally testify to these children's well-being, as will half the people here. No judge in Texas will remove thriving children from a good home to send them with a stranger who's only interested in cheap labor. Vernon climbed into his wagon, still sputtering threats, but they rang hollow. He snapped the reins and drove off in a cloud of dust, and as he disappeared from view, a cheer went up from the gathered crowd. People swarmed forward, offering congratulations and support, asking questions Josie couldn't quite process through the ringing in her ears. She'd claimed the Holloway name. She'd done it publicly, irrevocably, in front of witnesses who had spread the word throughout the county. She'd chosen her family, and in doing so, she'd claimed a future she'd never dared to imagine. Dane's hand was still in hers, warm and solid, anchoring her to this moment. When she finally looked up at him, his expression was soft and wondering, like he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "Josie Holloway," he said quietly, testing the name. "Has a nice ring to it." "I hope that's okay," Josie said, suddenly uncertain. "I didn't mean to presume." "It's more than okay," Dane interrupted gently. "It's an honor." The crowd lingered for a while longer, offering congratulations and support, but eventually people drifted away, returning to their own lives and leaving the Holloway family, because that's what they were now, officially in the eyes of Red Creek, standing in the yard as the winter sun began its descent toward the horizon. Josie realized she was still holding Dane's hand and started to pull away, suddenly self-conscious, but he gave her fingers a gentle squeeze before releasing them. The children stood close, their faces reflecting a mixture of excitement and residual fear, like they couldn't quite believe the danger had passed. "Can he really come back?" Marcus asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. "Can he take us away even after what everyone said?" Dane knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. "Legally, he could try, but Miss Winters was right. No judge is going to look at healthy, happy, educated children and decide they'd be better off with a stranger who only showed up when it was convenient. And I'll fight him every step of the way if he does try. You have my word on that." "We're really Holloways now?" Wren asked, her voice small and wondering. "For real?" "For real," Josie confirmed, her own voice shaking slightly with the enormity of what she'd done. She'd claimed a name that wasn't hers by birth, had publicly declared herself part of a family she had no legal right to, had possibly complicated Dane's life in ways she hadn't fully considered in the heat of the moment. But looking at her siblings' faces, seeing hope instead of fear for the first time in their lives, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. That evening, after the children had been fed and tucked into bed, still buzzing with the excitement of the day's events, Josie and Dane sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee between them. The house was quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the occasional creak of settling wood. "I should apologize," Josie started, but Dane held up a hand. "Don't. Whatever you're about to apologize for, don't. I claimed your name without asking. I made a public declaration that's going to have people assuming things about our relationship, about your intentions. I may have damaged your reputation beyond repair." Dane took a sip of his coffee, considering his words carefully. "My reputation was never as important to me as people seem to think. And as for claiming my name..." He paused, and when he met her eyes, there was something vulnerable in his expression that she'd never seen before. "You honored me today, Josie. You and those children chose to be part of my family when you had every reason not to trust in family at all. That's not something to apologize for. But people are going to talk. They're going to say I trapped you or that you've been taking advantage. Let them say it. The people whose opinions matter to me know the truth. And the truth is that having you all here, having a family again, after so many years alone..." He trailed off, his voice roughening. "I didn't realize how empty this house was until it was full." Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks. "We've made it louder, that's for sure, and messier." Dane's laugh was warm and genuine. "The best kind of mess, the kind that means life is being lived here, not just endured." They fell into comfortable silence, and Josie found herself studying Dane's profile in the firelight. He was a handsome man in a weathered, lived-in sort of way, the kind of face that told stories of hard work and harder losses, but also of resilience and quiet strength. She'd spent so many weeks focused on survival, on protecting her siblings and keeping them fed, that she'd barely allowed herself to notice him as anything other than their benefactor. But now, with Vernon's threat hanging in the air and her own rash declaration still echoing in her mind, she was acutely aware of him in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. This man had saved them, had given them everything when he owed them nothing, and she'd just publicly tied their names together in a way that Red Creek would interpret as something far more significant than a simple guardianship arrangement. "Dane," she said carefully, "what happens now? With Vernon? With the law? With everything?" He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her fully. "Now, we live our lives and let the gossips tire themselves out. Vernon might try to make legal trouble, but I meant what I said. I'll fight him. I've already sent word to a lawyer in Austin, a friend who owes me a favor. We'll make this as official as it needs to be. And if he pushes harder, if he finds a judge who doesn't care about what's best for the children, then we deal with it, together." Dane reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the gesture both comforting and charged with unspoken meaning. "You're not alone in this anymore, Josie. You don't have to carry everything by yourself." The words cracked something open inside her, some wall she'd built brick by brick over 19 years of learning that she could only ever rely on herself. Tears pricked her eyes and she blinked them back furiously, but Dane saw them anyway. "It's okay to let someone help," he said softly. "It's okay to trust that someone will stay." "I don't know how," Josie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every person who was supposed to stay left. How do I trust that you won't?" Dane was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing absent patterns on the back of her hand. "I can't give you guarantees about the future. None of us know what tomorrow brings, but I can tell you this. I'm not going anywhere by choice. This is my home, you're my family, and I protect what's mine." The possessive phrase should have rankled, should have made Josie's hackles rise after a lifetime of being treated as property. But the way Dane said it, with such quiet certainty and underlying tenderness, it didn't feel like ownership. It felt like belonging. The winter weeks that followed Vernon's visit were tense with waiting. Josie kept expecting legal papers to arrive, or for Vernon to return with a sheriff and court order. But as January turned to February and February edged toward March, the anticipated crisis never materialized. Word came through Tom Reed, who had contacts in the county seat, that Vernon had made inquiries but had been discouraged by the cost of legal proceedings and the unanimous testimony of Red Creek citizens about the children's well-being. "Seems he decided cheap labor wasn't worth the fight after all," Tom reported one afternoon when he stopped by to collect a horse Dane had been training, especially when Miss Winters made it clear she'd bury him in paperwork and character witnesses. The relief that washed over Josie was so intense it was almost painful. For the first time since her parents had driven away, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were actually safe. That this life they'd built wasn't a temporary reprieve, but something that might actually last. With the immediate threat removed, life on the Holloway Ranch settled into a new normal. The children thrived under the structure and security, growing not just physically, though the regular meals and warm shelter were certainly helping with that, but in confidence and skill. Marcus discovered a talent for working with wood and began crafting small furniture pieces under Dane's patient instruction. Samuel showed a gift for numbers and started helping Josie with the ranch accounts. And Wren, who'd been so quiet and frightened when they first arrived, now filled the house with chatter and laughter and the kind of mischief that healthy, happy children got into. But as the children flourished, Josie found herself wrestling with feelings she didn't know how to name. She'd catch herself watching Dane as he taught Samuel how to calculate feed ratios, or as he lifted Wren onto his shoulders to help her hang laundry on the line, or as he sat with Marcus in the evening, quietly discussing the boys' latest woodworking project. The casual affection he showed her siblings, the patient way he answered their endless questions, the obvious pride he took in their accomplishments. It all made something in her chest ache with longing for things she'd never even known she wanted. And then there were the moments when his attention turned to her, when he'd ask her opinion on ranch decisions or compliment her cooking or simply sit beside her on the porch in the evening, sharing comfortable silence while the children played in the yard. Those moments were both precious and terrifying, because they made her imagine futures that seemed too good to be possible. One evening in early March, after the children had gone to bed, Dane asked Josie to take a walk with him. The air still held winter's chill, but there were hints of coming spring, early wildflowers pushing through the hard ground, the scent of new growth on the breeze, birdsong that spoke of nesting and renewal. They walked in silence for a while, heading toward a small rise that overlooked the ranch and the surrounding countryside. The moon was nearly full, casting everything in silver light, and Josie could see for miles across the rolling Texas landscape. "I've been thinking," Dane said finally, his hands shoved in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "About what you said to Vernon, about choosing the Holloway name." Josie's heart started beating faster. "If it's caused problems, if you need me to clarify, it hasn't caused problems, but it's made me think about what it means, what we are to each other, what we could be." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility. Josie barely dared to breathe, afraid that any movement might shatter this moment. Dane turned to face her, and in the moonlight his expression was open and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "I told you once that I was helping you because of Sarah, because I'd failed her, and I couldn't fail someone else who needed help. And that was true at first, but it stopped being about Sarah a long time ago." "When?" Josie asked, her voice barely audible. "I think it was when you were sick with the fever, sitting beside your bed, watching you fight for every breath, terrified that I was going to lose you before I'd ever really known you. That's when I realized that this—" He gestured between them toward the house where the children slept, encompassing the whole of their makeshift family, "wasn't about redemption or second chances anymore. It was about you, about wanting you in my life, wanting to wake up every morning and see you at my table, wanting to build something real with you." Josie felt tears streaming down her face, but she made no move to wipe them away. "I don't know how to be what you need. I don't know how to be a wife or a partner or anything other than a survivor. You're already more than a survivor. You're one of the strongest, most determined people I've ever met. You've protected those children against impossible odds. You've learned everything I could teach you, and then some, and you've done it all while carrying wounds that would break most people." He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. "I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, but to do it here, with me, as my partner in truth, and not just in name. The children are already calling us family, and they're right. We are a family. The only question is whether we make it official or keep pretending that what we have is just convenience." Josie looked up at him, at this man who'd appeared in her life like an answer to prayers she'd been too beaten down to even pray, and felt something shift inside her. All her life she'd defined herself by what she wasn't. Not good enough, not pretty enough, not worthy of kindness or care. But standing here in the moonlight with Dane looking at her like she was something precious, she glimpsed the possibility of a different definition, one where she was exactly enough, exactly right, exactly what was needed. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I'm terrified of trusting this, of believing it's real, of letting myself want something this much because wanting things has only ever led to disappointment." "I know," Dane said softly. "Believe me, I know. I've spent 5 years keeping people at arm's length because losing Sarah taught me that caring too much means hurting too much. But you and those children crashed into my life and reminded me that the hurt is worth it, the risk is worth it, because the alternative is living half a life, and I'm done with that." He reached out and cupped her face in his calloused hands, his touch infinitely gentle. "I'm not asking you to stop being scared. I'm just asking you to be scared with me instead of alone, to take a chance on something good instead of always preparing for the next disaster." Josie leaned into his touch, letting herself draw strength from his steadiness. "What if I mess this up? What if I'm too damaged, too broken? Then we'll figure it out together. That's what partners do." He smiled, soft and warm. "You're not broken, Josie. You're healing, and healing takes time and patience and someone who will stand beside you through the hard parts." "Is that what you're offering? To stand beside me?" "That's exactly what I'm offering. In whatever way you'll have me, as a friend, as a partner, as—" He paused, took a breath. "As a husband, if you'll consider it." The word hung between them, enormous and impossible, and somehow exactly right. Husband, a permanent claim, a public declaration, a promise of forever, in a world where Josie had learned that forever was a myth. But maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to be. "I need time," Josie said finally, "not because I don't know what I want, but because I need to make sure I'm choosing this for the right reasons. Not because I'm grateful or scared or because it's convenient, but because it's what I actually want." Dane nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." They walked back to the house in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, full of possibility rather than tension. And when they reached the porch, Dane caught her hand and brought it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt like a promise. Over the next weeks, Josie found herself watching Dane with new eyes, paying attention to the small moments that revealed his character. The way he never lost his patience with the children, even when Samuel spilled a full bucket of milk or Marcus accidentally broke a fence rail. The way he spoke to his animals with respect and care, treating them as partners in the work rather than just tools. The way he always made sure Josie ate enough at dinner, remembering her tendency to give the best portions to the children. She noticed, too, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, with a warmth and tenderness that made her breath catch. And she noticed her own growing awareness of him, the way her heart beat faster when he entered a room, the way she found excuses to work beside him, the way she'd started imagining futures that included white dresses and wedding vows and forever. One morning in late March, as new grass was beginning to green the hillsides and wildflowers were blooming in riots of color, Josie came down to breakfast to find a piece of paper folded on her plate. She looked at Dane questioningly, but he just gestured for her to open it, while the children watched with barely suppressed excitement. Inside was a marriage application form from the county clerk's office. The line for groom's name had been filled in with Dane's careful handwriting, Dane Robert Holloway. The line for bride's name was blank, waiting. At the bottom, in the same careful script, Dane had written, "She can choose to carry my name. I've carried her in my heart a long time already." Josie looked up with tears in her eyes to find Dane watching her with quiet hope, the children practically vibrating with anticipation. "Is this a proposal?" she asked, her voice shaking. "It's an offer," Dane replied. "No pressure. No expectations. The ranch is yours, whether you sign this or not. The children have a home here regardless. This is just me asking if you want to make what we already have official. If you want to choose this life and this family, not just as shelter, but as home." Wren could no longer contain herself. "Say yes. Please say yes, Josie. We already told Mr. Holloway we'd be happy if he was really our brother-in-law," Marcus added, and Samuel nodded vigorously in agreement. Josie looked around the table at these faces that had become her whole world, the 3 children she'd sacrifice anything for, and the man who'd taught her that sacrifice shouldn't be the only form love took. She thought about the girl she'd been 7 months ago, standing in front of a falling-down shack with nothing but desperation and determination. She thought about all the small moments of kindness that had built up into this bigger thing, this life that felt almost too good to be real. And she realized that she'd already made her choice weeks ago, maybe even months ago. She'd just been too scared to admit it. "Yes," she said, and the word felt like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime in shadow. "Yes, I'll marry you." The children erupted in cheers, and Dane's face split into a grin so wide and genuine that it transformed him, making him look years younger. He stood and pulled Josie into an embrace that felt like coming home, and she let herself sink into it, let herself believe that this was real and lasting and hers. "We should make plans," Dane said when they finally pulled apart, still smiling. "Nothing fancy. I know that's not your style, but something meaningful. Something that marks this as the new beginning it is." "Spring wedding," Wren declared immediately, "with wildflowers everywhere. And a real party after," Marcus added, "with dancing and cake." Samuel, ever practical, asked, "When? How soon can we do it?" Josie and Dane looked at each other, and she saw her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Why wait? They were already a family in every way that mattered. Making it official was just acknowledging what everyone could already see. "Soon," Josie said, "as soon as we can arrange it." The next week was a whirlwind of activity. News of the upcoming wedding spread through Red Creek like wildfire, and the response was overwhelming. Miss Winters organized a group of town women to make Josie a dress, refusing to hear any protests about expense or necessity. Tom Reed offered the use of his barn for the celebration afterward. The local minister, a kind man named Reverend Matthews, agreed to perform the ceremony and suggested holding it outdoors under the same Texas sky that had witnessed Josie's lowest moment and her gradual transformation. Josie let herself be swept up in the preparations, still half expecting something to go wrong, for some disaster to strike and prove that she wasn't allowed to have this happiness. But the days passed peacefully, full of plans and excitement and small kindnesses from a community that had decided to claim her as one of their own. The dress the women made for her was simple but beautiful. White cotton, with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs, nothing fancy but made with care and attention. When Josie tried it on for the first time, she barely recognized herself in the mirror. She looked like a bride. She looked like someone who deserved good things. "You're beautiful," Wren breathed, watching from the doorway with wide eyes. "I look different," Josie said, turning to examine herself from all angles. "You look happy," Miss Winters corrected gently. "That's what's different. You're allowing yourself to be happy." The night before the wedding, unable to sleep, Josie found herself on the porch, looking up at the stars just as she had that first night when she'd let the Marlowe name die in her chest. So much had changed since then, and yet she was still fundamentally the same person, still fierce, still protective, still carrying scars that would never fully heal. But now she had something else too. She had hope. She had family. She had a future that extended beyond simple survival. Dane found her there, as if drawn by some instinct that told him she needed company. He sat beside her on the porch steps, close enough that their shoulders touched, and they sat in comfortable silence watching the stars wheel overhead. "Having second thoughts?" he asked finally, his tone light but with an undercurrent of genuine concern. "No, just thinking about how far we've come. How different everything is from that night in October when I stood in front of the shack and watched my parents drive away." "Do you regret any of it? The choices you made, the path that brought you here?" Josie considered the question seriously, thinking about all the fear and struggle, the moments of desperation, the weight of responsibility that had nearly crushed her. "No," she said finally. "I regret what happened to us as children. I regret that we had to suffer. But I don't regret the choices I made after they left, because every one of those choices led me here, to you, to this life we're building." Dane took her hand, linking their fingers together. "Tomorrow, you become my wife. But you're already my partner, my equal, my best friend. The ceremony is just making official what's already true." "I love you," Josie said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could second-guess them. "I don't know if I've said that out loud before, but I do. I love you for seeing us when everyone else looked away. I love you for giving without expecting anything back. I love you for teaching me that family isn't about blood, it's about choice." Dane turned to her, and in the starlight, she could see the emotion shining in his eyes. "I love you too. I think I've loved you since that first morning when you stood in front of that shack and said, 'Just Josie,' like daring the world to make something of it. You were so fierce and proud and determined, and I knew right then that you were someone special." They kissed then, a gentle coming together that felt like a promise and a celebration all at once. And when they finally pulled apart, Josie felt settled in a way she never had before, like all the scattered pieces of herself had finally found their proper places. Tomorrow, she would marry Dane Holloway. Tomorrow, she would stand in front of witnesses and claim this life as her own. Tomorrow, she would stop being just Josie and become Josie Holloway, in truth and law and permanence. But tonight, sitting under the stars with her hand in Dane's and her heart full of hope, she was exactly who and where she was meant to be. Morning came with a wash of golden light that painted the Texas landscape in shades of amber and rose. Josie woke to find Wren already awake beside her, the little girl's eyes bright with excitement. "It's your wedding day," Wren whispered, as if saying it too loud might break the spell. Josie pulled her sister close, breathing in the scent of the lavender soap they'd used the night before when she'd helped all three children bathe and prepare for today. "It is. Are you ready?" "I've been ready forever," Wren declared, then added more seriously, "Are you scared?" The question caught Josie off guard, but she answered honestly. "A little, but it's a good kind of scared, like standing at the edge of something wonderful and not quite believing you're allowed to have it." The twins appeared in the doorway, already dressed in the new shirts Miss Winters had helped them make. They looked scrubbed and nervous, and so much healthier than they had 7 months ago that it made Josie's throat tight with emotion. "The whole town's already gathering," Marcus reported. "Mr. Reed says there are more people coming than he expected. Word spread pretty far." "Everyone wants to see you and Mr. Holloway get married," Samuel added. "Miss Winters says it's because people love a good love story, especially one that started with helping folks in need." Josie felt a flutter of panic. She'd imagined something small and quiet, just the immediate family and maybe a few neighbors. The thought of standing in front of a crowd, of being the center of attention, made her want to hide under the covers. As if sensing her distress, Wren squeezed her hand. "You don't have to be scared of them. They're not like the people who used to look at us like we were trash. These people are happy for us." Out of the mouths of babes, Josie thought, and forced herself to take a steadying breath. Wren was right. The people gathering weren't there to judge or condemn. They were there to celebrate, to witness the transformation of 4 abandoned children and a lonely rancher into something whole and beautiful. Miss Winters arrived an hour later with 3 other women from town, all carrying dishes for the celebration and wearing their Sunday best. They shooed the children out and helped Josie into her wedding dress, fussing over buttons and adjusting the simple veil they'd fashioned from lace curtains donated by Mrs. Henderson. "You look lovely, dear," Miss Winters said, stepping back to admire her handiwork. "Absolutely lovely." Josie looked at herself in the small mirror and hardly recognized the woman staring back. The dress fit perfectly, emphasizing the slight curves she'd developed now that regular meals were filling out her too thin frame. Her dark hair had been brushed until it shone and pinned up with wildflowers that Wren and the twins had picked that morning. But it was her face that shocked her most. The eyes that had always looked haunted now held light, and her expression, usually so guarded and wary, was soft with anticipation. "I never thought I'd have this," Josie whispered. "A wedding, a real family, people who wanted to celebrate with me instead of curse my existence." One of the other women, Mrs. Porter, who ran the general store, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Every girl deserves a wedding day, sweetheart, and you've earned this happiness more than most." They walked together to the clearing behind the barn, where Reverend Matthews had set up a simple altar made of pine logs and decorated with more wildflowers. Someone had strung lanterns in the trees for later, when the celebration would continue into the evening. Chairs had been arranged in rows, and Josie was stunned to see them nearly full. She recognized people from town, neighboring ranchers, even some folks from farther out who must have traveled hours to be here. The crowd hushed when they saw her, and Josie felt every eye turn in her direction. For a moment, the old panic threatened to overwhelm her, the instinct to make herself small, to disappear, to not be seen. But then she caught sight of Dane standing at the altar, and everything else faded away. He was dressed in a dark suit that must have been borrowed because she'd never seen him wear anything but work clothes. His hair was neatly combed, his boots polished, and the expression on his face when he saw her was one of pure, unguarded wonder. He looked at her like she was something precious, something miraculous, and in his eyes, Josie saw reflected back the woman she was becoming, strong, worthy, beloved. Wren and the twins walked ahead of her, scattering flower petals with solemn concentration. Josie had no one to give her away, no father to walk her down the aisle, but she found she didn't need one. She walked on her own feet, making her own choice, claiming her own future with every step. When she reached Dane, he took both her hands in his, and the warmth of his touch steadied her racing heart. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat and began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Dane Robert Holloway and Josephine Marlowe." "Just Josie," Josie interrupted softly, and a ripple of understanding laughter ran through the crowd. "My name is just Josie. No middle name, no maiden name I want to carry forward. Just Josie." The Reverend smiled kindly. "Just Josie, then. We are here to witness the union of Dane and Josie, 2 people who have already proven that family is not about blood, but about choice, not about obligation, but about love freely given." He continued with the traditional words of the ceremony, but Josie barely heard them. She was too focused on Dane's face, on the way his thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand, on the certainty she saw in his eyes that this was right, this was meant to be. When it came time for vows, Dane spoke first, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Josie, When I met you, you were already one of the strongest people I'd ever encountered. You'd survived things that would break most adults, and you were still fighting to protect the people you loved. I'm not standing here today because I rescued you. I'm standing here because you let me be part of your life, because you trusted me when you had every reason not to trust anyone. You've taught me that love isn't about grand gestures or perfect moments. It's about showing up every day, about choosing each other even when it's hard, about building something solid from whatever materials you have. I promise to show up for you every day for the rest of my life. I promise to be the steady ground you can build on. I promise that you and those children will always have a home, always have someone in your corner, always have someone who sees you for exactly who you are and loves you for it. Josie's vision blurred with tears, but she blinked them back, needing to see his face clearly for this. When it was her turn to speak, she'd planned to use the traditional vows, but looking at Dane, she found different words rising up from somewhere deep inside her. Dane, I came into your life with nothing but 3 scared children and a determination to survive. You could have turned us away, or helped us briefly and sent us on our way, or given us just enough to get by. Instead, you gave us everything. You gave us safety and food and shelter, yes, but more than that, you gave us dignity. You treated us like we mattered when the world had told us we didn't. You taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. You showed me what real strength looks like. Not the kind that comes from enduring pain, but the kind that comes from choosing kindness even when the world gives you every reason to be hard. I can't promise I won't be difficult sometimes, or that I won't struggle with trusting good things, or that I won't wake up some morning still expecting disaster. But I can promise that I'll choose you every single day. I'll choose this family, this life, this love we're building, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret the day you decided to stop and help 4 strangers who needed you. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd by the time she finished. Even Tom Reed was suspiciously clearing his throat, and Mrs. Henderson was openly weeping into her handkerchief. Reverend Matthews had to pause to collect himself before continuing. Do you, Dane, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? I do, Dane said without hesitation. And do you, Josie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, in sickness and in health, as long as you both shall live? Josie looked at Dane, at this man who'd changed everything, and felt a certainty settle over her like a benediction. I do. Then by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Dane, you may kiss your bride. Dane cupped Josie's face gently in his hands and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke of promises and forever. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause, but Josie barely heard them. In that moment, there was only Dane and the future stretching out before them, bright and full of possibility. When they finally pulled apart, both grinning like fools, Wren threw her arms around both of them, followed immediately by the twins. They stood there in a family embrace while the crowd cheered, and Josie felt something settle deep in her soul, a sense of belonging, of being exactly where she was meant to be. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Red Creek had seen in years. Tables groaned under the weight of food that townspeople had brought: roasted chicken and beef, fresh bread, pies and cakes of every variety, preserves and pickles and dishes that represented the best cooking the community had to offer. Someone had brought a fiddle, someone else a guitar, and soon music filled the air as couples took to the makeshift dance floor in Tom Reed's barn. Dane led Josie out for the first dance, and she stumbled over her own feet, laughing. I don't know how to dance. Neither do I, really, Dane admitted, but I think the secret is just to move and try not to step on each other's feet. They swayed together while their neighbors clapped and cheered, and if their dancing was more shuffling than anything graceful, no one seemed to mind. What mattered was the joy on their faces, the way they looked at each other like the rest of the world had faded away. Later, Miss Winters pulled Josie aside, her expression more serious. I want to talk to you about something, dear, an opportunity that might interest you. Josie felt a flicker of the old wariness but pushed it down. What kind of opportunity? Well, as you know, I run the school in town. But there are so many children in the outlying areas who can't make the journey every day. Children who are growing up without education because their families can't spare them for the travel time. Miss Winters paused, gathering her thoughts. I've been watching how you teach your siblings, the patience you show, the way you make learning feel important and achievable. And I've been thinking about that old barn of yours, the one on the property Dane helps you maintain. The barn? Josie repeated, confused about where this was going. It could be converted into a school, a place for the children who can't get to town, the ones who are falling through the cracks, orphans, children from struggling families, the ones who need education most but have the least access to it. Miss Winters' eyes were bright with enthusiasm. You could teach them, Josie. You understand what it's like to feel invisible, to be overlooked. You could reach these children in ways I never could. Josie felt her heart start to race. I'm not a trained teacher. I barely have any education myself. You have something more valuable than formal training. You have empathy and determination and the ability to make children feel seen and valued. The basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic I can help you with. But the rest, the part that really matters, you already know. Dane appeared at Josie's elbow, having clearly overheard at least part of the conversation. What do you think? He asked Josie. It's your decision, but I think it's a wonderful idea. Josie thought about the children she'd seen in Red Creek and beyond, the ones with haunted eyes and too thin frames, the ones who moved through the world trying not to be noticed, the ones who'd given up on believing they deserved anything better. She thought about the note her siblings had written her when she was sick, the painstaking letters that represented not just literacy but hope, the belief that they could learn and grow and become something more than their circumstances dictated. We'd need supplies, she said slowly, her mind already racing ahead. Slates, books, paper, pencils, and desks of some kind, even if they're just rough benches. Miss Winters beamed. I can help with that. The town can contribute, and there are organizations that provide materials for frontier schools. And we'd need to spread the word. Let people know it's available, especially the families who might not think their children deserve education or who can't afford to lose a worker even for part of the day. We'll make it work around planting and harvest seasons, Dane suggested. Schedule classes when children are most able to attend. Josie felt excitement building in her chest, pushing back against the fear and doubt. This was something she could do, something meaningful that would take her own suffering and transform it into something that helped others. All right, she said, and the word felt like stepping off another cliff, but this time she knew there would be solid ground to land on. Let's do it. Let's build a school. The rest of the celebration passed in a blur of well wishes and congratulations, of dancing and laughter, and the kind of joy that comes from community coming together to celebrate something good. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Dane and Josie stood together on the edge of the crowd, watching their neighbors enjoy themselves. Mrs. Holloway, Dane said, testing out the name. How does it feel? Josie considered the question seriously. Like putting on clothes that actually fit for the first time in my life? Like being called by a name I chose instead of one I was stuck with? She leaned into his side and he wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Like home. Good, Dane said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Because you are home. We all are. The weeks that followed the wedding were filled with purposeful activity. True to her word, Miss Winters helped organize the conversion of the old barn into a schoolhouse. Men from town donated labor and materials, women sewed curtains and cushions, and slowly the dilapidated structure transformed into something warm and welcoming. Marcus used his woodworking skills to help build simple desks and benches, taking obvious pride in contributing to something so important. Dane carved a sign from a thick piece of oak, the letters deep and clear. Holloway School, a place where everyone has a name. He hung it above the door on a bright April morning, and Josie stood looking at it with tears in her eyes. It's perfect, she whispered. You're perfect, Dane replied, pulling her close. This idea, this dream of helping children who need it most, that's who you are, Josie. Someone who takes her own pain and turns it into purpose. The first day of school, Josie wasn't sure anyone would come. She stood in the doorway as the sun rose, watching the road anxiously, half convinced that all their work had been for nothing. But then she saw them, first one child, then two. Then a whole group walking together. Some were as young as Wren, others nearly grown. Some were clean and well-fed, others bore the unmistakable marks of poverty and neglect. But they all came. By the time the sun was fully up, there were 15 children sitting on the benches, looking at Josie with expressions ranging from curious to wary to hopeful. She recognized some of them. The Garfield children who lived in a soddy 5 miles out, the Anderson boy whose father had died and whose mother was struggling to keep the farm going alone, a few kids from town whose families were too poor to spare them for the regular school. Josie walked to the front of the room, her heart pounding, and picked up a piece of chalk. On the board, she wrote one word in large, clear letters: name. She turned to face the children, seeing herself reflected in so many of their faces. "The first lesson is the most important one," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "Your name matters. You matter. I don't care where you came from, what your family situation is, or what anyone has told you about your worth. In this school, you are seen, you are valued, and you are important." She pointed to the word on the board. "Some of you might have names you love, names that make you proud. Some of you might have names that hurt to hear because of who gave them to you or what they represent. But here, you get to decide what your name means. You get to stand up and say it like it matters." She gestured to a small boy in the front row, no more than 7, with patches on his patches and feet wrapped in rags. "What's your name?" The boy ducked his head, mumbling something inaudible. "I can't hear you," Josie said gently. "Stand up, look at me, and tell me your name like you're proud of it." The boy stood slowly, his hands shaking. "But Billy Carson," he whispered. "Asilah." "Louder," Josie encouraged. "Say it like it means something." "Billy Carson," the boy repeated, a little stronger. "Again, like you believe you deserve to take up space in this world." "Billy Carson." This time the words rang out clear and strong, and the boy's face transformed with something like wonder. "That's right, Billy Carson. Welcome to Holloway School. I'm glad you're here." She went around the room, making each child stand and say their name clearly, giving them perhaps the first time in their lives that an adult had demanded they claim their own identity with pride. By the time she'd gone through all 15, the room felt different, charged with possibility, with the radical idea that these overlooked children might actually matter. Teaching was harder than Josie had anticipated, but also more rewarding. She learned to tailor lessons to different ages and abilities, to be patient when children struggled, to celebrate small victories. Some of the older children could barely read, having spent their lives working instead of learning. The younger ones had energy that sometimes made focusing difficult. But slowly, surely, progress happened. 3 weeks into the school's operation, she noticed a girl lingering outside during lunch, not quite brave enough to come in. Josie recognized the look. This was a child who'd been told she wasn't welcome places, who expected rejection. "Are you interested in learning?" Josie asked, walking out to meet her. The girl, maybe 12 years old with tangled red hair and suspicious green eyes, shrugged. "Maybe, but I ain't got no proper name. Folks just call me Red on account of my hair." Josie's heart squeezed. "Well, Red, that's a name if you want it to be. Or if you want something different, something just yours, you can choose that too. What matters is that you have a name you claim." "What if I don't know what I want?" the girl asked, her voice small. "Then you take your time figuring it out. Come inside, learn your letters, think about who you want to be. The name will come when you're ready." The girl, who eventually chose the name Rose because it sounded prettier than Red, became one of Josie's most dedicated students. And she wasn't the last. Word spread about the school that accepted everyone, the teacher who understood what it meant to feel invisible, and enrollment grew. By summer, they had 23 regular students and had to add another room to the barn. By fall, Josie had to bring on Miss Winters part-time to help manage the growing numbers. And with each child who learned to read, who discovered they were capable of learning, who stood up straight when they said their name, Josie felt her own wounds healing a little more. On a warm evening in late September, almost a year since her parents had abandoned them, Josie stood on the porch of the house she now shared with Dane and watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The children were inside doing homework, actual homework that they took seriously because they'd learned that education was valuable. The ranch was thriving under their combined management. The school had become a fixture of the community, so accepted now that the people who'd once gossiped about impropriety were now singing Josie's praises as a pillar of the community. It felt surreal, this life she'd built. Sometimes she still woke up expecting to find herself back in the falling down shack, starving and desperate. But then she'd see Dane beside her, or hear her siblings laughing, or smell breakfast cooking, and reality would reassert itself in the best possible way. Dane joined her on the porch, handing her a cup of coffee the way he did every evening, and they stood together in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking," Dane said eventually, "about that old shack where I first saw you. We should tear it down, use the lumber for something useful." Josie considered this, surprised to find the idea didn't hurt the way it might have once. "What would we use it for? Extension to the school, maybe? Or firewood? Or we could build something new in its place, something that represents where you are now instead of where you've been." "A new beginning," Josie mused. "I like that." "Speaking of new beginnings," Dane said carefully, "I wanted to talk to you about something." Josie turned to look at him, noting the nervous energy in his posture. "What is it? How would you feel about expanding our family? Not just the children we teach, but—" He paused, took a breath. "How would you feel about having a child of our own?" Josie's breath caught. She'd been so focused on survival, on healing, on building the school that she hadn't let herself think about this possibility. "Are you saying you want—" "I'm saying I want a future with you that includes everything. I want to see you teaching our child the way you teach the others. I want to watch you be a mother by choice instead of by necessity. I want—" He stopped, his voice rough with emotion. "I want to give you the family you should have had from the beginning, one built on love instead of obligation." Josie felt tears streaming down her face, but they were good tears, healing tears. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want that too." They held each other as the sun finished setting, as stars began to appear overhead, as the night sounds of Texas rose around them. Inside, they could hear Wren helping the twins with their arithmetic, their voices raised in good-natured argument over the answer to a problem. The sounds of family, of home, of love freely given and gratefully received. The following spring, as wildflowers bloomed across the Texas hills and new calves wobbled on uncertain legs in the pasture, Josie stood in front of the Holloway School with Dane at her side and looked at what they'd built. The building had grown to 3 rooms now, with space for nearly 40 students. The sign Dane had carved still hung above the door, but they'd added another one below it, commissioned from Marcus, who'd become quite skilled at woodworking. "No blood, all heart." Inside, children of all ages worked at their lessons, their voices a cheerful cacophony of learning and discovery. Billy Carson, now a confident 8-year-old, was helping a younger child sound out words. Rose was working on advanced mathematics with Miss Winters, her quick mind finally getting the education it deserved. The Anderson boy was reading aloud to a small group, his voice steady and sure, in a way it never could have been a year ago. And Josie, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly, where a new life was just beginning to make itself known, felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She'd started with nothing, less than nothing, really. She'd been a girl with no name, no family, no future worth imagining. And through a combination of her own fierce determination and the unexpected kindness of one good man, she'd built something beautiful. "What are you thinking about?" Dane asked, noticing her expression. Josie smiled, taking his hand and placing it over her stomach so he could feel the tiny flutter of movement that had started just that morning. "I'm thinking about names, about how a name can be a curse or a blessing, how it can chain you to a past you want to forget or bind you to a future worth claiming. And what have you decided?" "That Josie Holloway is the best name I've ever had, because it's the one I chose. It represents love and family and home and everything I never thought I'd deserve." She looked up at him, this man who'd saved her by letting her save herself, who'd given her space to heal and grow and become someone she was proud of. "It represents you." Dane pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You gave that name meaning, not the other way around. You took it and made it something worth being proud of." They stood there together, watching through the window as their students learned and grew, as the children who'd been invisible became seen, as names that had been burdens became badges of honor. This was their legacy, Josie realized, Not just the school or the ranch or even the children they were raising. Their legacy was the radical idea that everyone deserved to be seen, to be valued, to have a name they could say with pride. That evening, as the last students left for the day and the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Josie gathered her siblings in the main room of the house. They sat around the table where they'd shared so many meals, where they'd learned to trust that there would be food tomorrow and the day after, where they'd slowly transformed from frightened, starving children into confident young people with futures spread before them. "I have something for each of you," Josie said, pulling out 3 small boxes she'd commissioned from Marcus's latest woodworking project. Wren opened hers first, gasping at the delicate bracelet inside, engraved with words that made her eyes fill with tears. Wren Holloway. Braveheart. The twins opened theirs together, revealing matching pocket watches, simple but beautiful. On the inside of each cover engraved words. For Marcus, Holloway, skilled hands, strong heart. For Samuel, Holloway, sharp mind, kind soul. "You don't have to take the Holloway name if you don't want to," Josie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're old enough now to make your own choices. But I wanted you to know that you're family, truly family, whether you share our name or not." "Are you kidding?" Marcus said, already fastening his watch chain. "I've been writing Marcus Holloway in my notebooks for months. I was just waiting for permission to make it official." "Same," Samuel added, his usually quiet voice firm with conviction. "We stopped being Marlowes the day we chose to be Holloways. This just makes it legal." Wren threw her arms around Josie's neck. "We're really a family, a real forever family." "The realest," Josie confirmed, holding her sister close while the twins joined the embrace and Dane wrapped his arms around all of them. Later that night, after the children had gone to bed still chattering excitedly about their gifts and their names and their future, Josie and Dane stood once more on their porch, looking out over the land they'd built a life on. "Do you ever think about them?" Dane asked quietly. "Your parents. Wonder where they are, if they're still alive." Josie considered the question honestly. "Sometimes, but not with anger anymore, or even really with pain. They're just people who made terrible choices and couldn't be what we needed them to be. I hope they found whatever they were looking for when they left, but I don't need them to be different than they were. Their leaving made this possible." She gestured to encompass the house, the ranch, the school in the distance, the life they'd built. "You've done something remarkable, you know," Dane said. "Taken trauma and transformed it into purpose, turned pain into something that helps others heal." "We did it together," Josie corrected. "I had the determination, but you gave me the foundation to build on. You showed me what steady, reliable love looks like. You taught me that I was worth more than just surviving." Dane pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I love you," he said simply. "Today, tomorrow, and every day after. You and the family we've built and the life we're creating." "I love you too," Josie replied, "more than I knew it was possible to love anyone." They stood there in the warm spring darkness, 2 people who'd found each other when they both needed saving, who'd built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their pasts. Around them, the Texas night sang with cricket song and distant coyote calls, familiar and comforting in their wild music. Inside the house, 3 children slept peacefully, their dreams untainted by the fear and hunger that had once defined their nights. In Josie's womb, a new life grew, a child who would be born into love and stability and the kind of family that made you feel safe. In the school down the road, books waited to be read by children who were learning that their names mattered, that they mattered, that the circumstances of their birth didn't have to define their futures. And Josie Holloway, no longer just Josie, no longer a girl with no name, but a woman who'd claimed her identity and her future with both hands, felt a peace settle over her that had nothing to do with the absence of struggle and everything to do with the presence of love. She'd been born into a family that saw her as a burden. She'd been raised in an environment that taught her she was worthless. She'd spent 19 years learning to make herself small and quiet and invisible, believing that was the only way to survive. But standing here now, with Dane's arms around her and her family safe, and the future stretching out bright and full of possibility, she understood a truth that would have seemed impossible a year ago. She wasn't defined by where she came from. She wasn't limited by the name she'd been born with or the circumstances that had tried to break her. She was defined by the choices she made, the love she chose to accept, the family she chose to build. She was Josie Holloway, wife, sister, teacher, soon-to-be mother. A woman who'd learned that the strongest foundations weren't built on blood, but on choice. That the truest families were the ones you claimed, not the ones you were born into. That a name could be shed like old skin and a new one claimed. Not to run from the past, but to walk purposefully into a future worth having. Above them, the Texas stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent witnesses to human joy and sorrow alike. But in this small corner of the vast universe, in this moment of quiet contentment, Josie felt seen by something greater than herself. Whether it was God, or fate, or simply the universe's tendency toward beauty, even in broken places, she didn't know. What she knew was this: she had a home, she had a family, she had a name she'd chosen and a future she'd claimed. And no one, not her parents, not distant relatives with legal claims, not the ghosts of her own past trauma, could take that away from her. The light from the windows behind them cast a warm glow across the porch, and Josie could see their shadows stretched long across the yard. Two figures standing close together, connected not by blood or obligation, but by something stronger and more enduring: choice, commitment, and love that had been tested and proven true. "Ready to go inside?" Dane asked softly. Josie took one last look at the star-scattered sky, breathing in the cool spring air and the scent of new growth. Then she nodded and let Dane lead her inside, into the warmth and light and love of the home they'd built together. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and in the darkness, the sign above the school entrance swayed gently in the night breeze. Holloway School, a place where everyone has a name. And below it, the newer sign that spoke to deeper truths: no blood, all heart. It was more than a motto for a school. It was a manifesto for living, a declaration of values, a testament to the radical power of choosing love over legacy, family over blood, future over past. And in the house where a former nameless girl now slept peacefully beside the man who'd taught her she was worth loving, those words rang true in ways that went beyond mere philosophy. They were lived truth, embodied daily in every choice, every kindness, every moment of choosing to build rather than destroy, to heal rather than harm, to love rather than fear. Josie Holloway had found her name, her family, and her home, and in doing so, she'd shown others that they could do the same. That was the legacy she'd leave, not wealth or fame or power, but the simple, profound truth that everyone deserves to be seen, to be valued, to have a name they can speak with pride. In Red Creek, Texas, in the year 1874, that was a revolutionary idea. But revolutions have to start somewhere, and this one started with a girl who had nothing, a man who had everything to give, and the radical act of choosing to build a family based not on blood, but on heart. And they lived truly and completely with all the joy and struggle and beautiful messiness that comes with real life and real love. Not happily ever after in the fairy tale sense, but happily ever onward, building, growing, loving, and teaching others to do the same. The story of the Holloway family had no neat ending because the best stories never really end. They just continue, rippling outward, touching lives in ways both seen and unseen, proving that sometimes the greatest strength comes not from enduring suffering alone, but from having the courage to accept help, to choose love, and to believe that you deserve a name worth claiming. And in that truth, there was freedom, there was hope, there was home.